Shots of Kosinski's first stroll in Warsaw's Łazienki Park after an absence from Poland of 30 years.
I feel very much at home here, very comfortable. I've always been enamored of my Polishness and with my universality, which I've gained owing to this Polishness of mine. Yet I've felt very foreign and unaware of my Polishness in the sense of a state of being. One might ask why I'm here now that my books are being published. They're not published yet. Let's hope they will be. Every writer wants to be read. This is why one writes. I don't mean the size of the readership, let alone having bestsellers, since I was told I won't make big bucks out of it. The thing is to maintain some form of dialogue.
This is what Jerzy Kosinski told us during his 1989 visit. 12 months later, the Polish translation of The Painted Bird paved the way for the much yearned for dialogue and for a long line of autograph seekers. Kosinski took longer to make a name for himself in the annals of Polish literature.
First photographs. He took the first photos of me when I was a lot younger. I'll see you inside.
Jerzy.
Zbyszek, for God's sake. Oh my God.
We must meet. You will have a few moments, won't you?
This is incredible. Have I changed as much as you?
I guess so.
But your voice is the same. I always point out, nothing's changed. The Polishness has remained, and this can be heard in the voice. So see you inside then?
If you saw Polanski's Two Men and a Wardrobe, you must have noticed this man who carries the wardrobe. I'm the one. Welcome.
Hence, it was a natural thing, and this is how The Painted Bird was born. Since I'm past all hope on that one, just as an aside, I may say I didn't foresee that a book about a 6-year-old with a Hieronymus Bosch on the cover, which in a way indicates a large-scale imagination, might close the mental gates to my country, which, I spell it out clearly in Polish, for 24 years was my homeland, and, don't forget, a Jewish homeland for 1,000 years. I could no longer say, "How are you?" to my lover, or watch my mother die in the bed in which I am sleeping now in Warsaw. These are very important things for a man, possibly indispensable for a writer.
As you come here, your books are still unknown. You don't see this as a favorable situation, since you come here as a fulfillment, or rather completion, of the Polish myth in which America is a place where you can just arrive and become a great writer.
It's true. It is. You've just said that I've created my own image.
Yes, that's what I said.
If I may correct you, I'm not in the business of image making. I really don't make an image for myself. I'm foreign, so I don't care if I'm allowed to say this on state-owned TV or not. I don't care what others will think of me, because I'm living my own life on my own terms. Life is an incredible gift, which needs to be respected, maybe even more than its giver. This is what I care about. As long as I remain myself, as long as I don't assault you or interfere with this TV broadcast, to which I have no right, of course. This is my first time here in 30 years, and, if I may boast a little, owing to my books, I've been in a number of broadcasts from TV stations worldwide. So this is not image making. The image I make is the book, unfortunately currently unavailable in Polish. So my books project my image.
I called you in the morning.
Yes?
Could you stand a little higher by the mirror? I'd like to take your picture.
I'm nearly climbing a pedestal.
Yes, these are very famous stairs.
I bought a dictionary of sexology by Zbigniew Lev Starowicz, published by Omnipress Publishers, Warsaw, in 1986, so it's almost up to date. It was okayed by the Family Improvement Society, price 200 zlotys, quite moderate. Pocketbook format, as you can see. This dictionary contains some fascinating stuff. I've made a larger copy since I'm planning to come back to Poland. Gentlemen, don't spy on my papers. I have absolutely nothing to do with the powers that be. I am only where I am now. That is, I'm here as myself. Revisions, claims, retributions are other people's business, not mine. Literature is not part of social engineering, courtesy of your local housing department. Quote, lack of familiarity with certain words can make reading this book very difficult. On the other hand, familiarity with that vocabulary can make contacts very difficult. For example, sexual abstinence. Oh, we all know that. Abusus in venere, excessive sexual activity. Imagine, could I possibly tell the lady on my couch to stand up so I can fold out the bed because I had an excessive urge for abusus in venere? I couldn't. Now, passing from A to P. Under P, there's a fascinating item. Paraphimosis. Capistration. The Spanish collar. It doesn't say what all this is. It only says, after sudden retraction of the foreskin beyond the glands, its forward end remains stuck behind the coronal sulcus. This sounds like Interior Ministry jargon.
A word about literature. We don't know your work. We'll be able to appreciate it once it's published, in a year or two. Could you describe it in a word or two?
Fascinating.
Thank you very much.
When asked about your hopes of life, would you say that it's just instinctual, instincts which are then confirmed in the form of adventure or in an act of fate?
It's a constant process of redefining yourself, looking at oneself day to day and asking what's new, to see if I'm different from my yesterday's self, if there is an added value, a new idea. All this to remind us that life is an incredible gift, like no other. Death does not count at all. One does not have to bow to it unless one writes about it. So it translates into the full enjoyment of life. Everyone is capable of experiencing it. Books might be helpful, and I am not stating this because I am a writer.
I was assigned as a detective at the Midtown Detective Squad back in May of 1991. And it was here that I was assigned the investigation of the death of the writer Jerzy Kosinski. We got a call from the uniform officers that there was a deceased male. and West 57th Street between 6th and 5th Avenue. So at the time I was working with Detective Castillo, and we went over to, I'll give you the exact, 60 West 57th Street, apartment 18K. I learned as soon as I got there that the deceased man was the writer Jerzy Kosinski. And that's how I got involved in it. We went into his apartment. His wife, Mrs. Kosinski, was there. And I went into the bathroom right next to the sleeping area of the writer, and I observed him in the bathtub. Without going into any real specific details, there was no indication of any violence or any crime. And we interviewed his wife. We observed certain things around the bathtub, and we made a determination after reading his note, after looking at the items around the bathtub, as well as his body, that he was not a victim of a crime.
Kosinski, found dead May 3rd in the bathtub of his Upper West Side Manhattan apartment, died of acute intoxication from the combined effects of glutamide, a generic prescription sleeping drug, barbiturates, opiates, and alcohol, said Ellen Barokoff, a spokeswoman for the City Medical Examiner's Office.
Hush, little baby, don't you cry. You know your ma is bound to die. Oh, my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brother, too late, but never mind. Oh, my trials, Lord, soon be over. Jordan River is chilly and cold. It chills the body, but it warms the soul. Oh, my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brother, too late, but never mind. Oh, my trials, Lord, soon be over.
I was at home when I heard that Jerzy had committed suicide. A friend called me, a friend at the New York Times, and he told me they'd just gotten the news. And I hung up, and my first reaction was anger. Anger. I was mad at Jerzy. And I was mad at him for leaving us. I loved Jerzy. In many ways, the best man I've ever known in my life. So I was angry with him for taking his own life, and I was angry because it seemed to me that, in a way, the other side had won. The side that had hounded Jerzy for years and years. And I thought, the bastards have won. They drove him to taking his own life. That was probably not an entirely accurate observation. As I said, I think that Jerzy took his own life, committed suicide, because he was losing control of his life. He was losing his identity as a writer. He was not writing as well. Someone had said before that Jerzy was a man of many masks, and he hid behind these masks. Well, indeed he did. He had a lot of masks, whether he was the the ski instructor or the professional photographer or the polo player or the sexual adventurer. They were a way of hiding. The same way you could hide in his apartment, curled up behind the books on his library shelf, and you couldn't find him in his own apartment. He had a place to hide, so he could hide behind the masks. He was a terribly vulnerable human being. And if you keep these masks around, you can hide behind the masks. You don't know who Jerzy Kosinski is. But what Jerzy Kosinski was at bottom, in his heart, was a writer, and a very moral writer, concerned with the most important issues of our time. The first time I ever met Jerzy was in 1968 or 69. I was at Harper's, and I said we liked each other instantly, and he said, let us do a book together. And what is the most important topic you know? And I said, I don't know, let me think about it. And then I said, death is the most important topic I know of. And his eyes lit up, and he said, yes, you will write one chapter, and then I will write one chapter. And for about 5 minutes, we spoke about writing a book together about this enormously important topic, death, life and death. Well, that was the way Jerzy thought. He thought about important things. He was involved in important issues, and at bottom, these were moral issues. They were issues about life and death. And he was, I think, the most moral man I have ever known.
In other words, I had to divide my childhood into the time when I went to the kindergarten, which means until I was 6, until the age of 6, which was more or less a routine, standard kindergarten for the children, middle-class children in Lodz. Then, from the age of 6 until the age of almost 11 and a half, I was separated from my parents, more or less, moving from place to place. I was traveling, so to speak, looking for foster parents who would keep me. People would say, well, we can stay here for a while, because I had to hide from the Germans. Because I was a Jew, and they were non-Jewish, and they had to protect me and hide me. So my education at the time was not a formalized education, since I was more or less I depended on what these peasants, they were peasants, what would they teach their children. In each place I was allowed to go to the Sunday church school, or I would join special groups which were taught by ministers in the church. I was not very often there, since I was afraid that someone might not know who I am, and they may tell the Germans, and I may be picked up. Even though I was Jewish, to maintain, to pretend for everyone that I was not, I went to several classes preparing me for the First Communion, and I went to the First Communion.
My name is Edvard Varho. I come from this square, right where we are standing. This is my family home. Once there was a building here on this lot. It extended from somewhere behind that fence and went along that way. It was a 6-family house. There were 3 entrances to apartments from the road and 3 from the backyard. In 1941, the Kosinski family arrived here. Jerzy, his father, his mom, and another little boy, Jerzy's adopted brother. They survived the war here until 1944. It isn't true that Jerzy Kosinski was knocked about or suffered any distress. This is completely untrue. He spent those years in our house here, in the 3rd apartment from where we are standing. There was one entrance from the other side, then another one, and another one to the apartment where Jerzy Kosinski lived with his parents. I stress, he survived the entire occupation from 41 to 44. He was nowhere else and didn't suffer anything anywhere, not like he writes in The Painted Bird. That's absolutely untrue.
Is The Painted Bird your autobiography?
The novel is written and planned as a novel, about the world seen from a 6-year-old's perspective, written by a man then aged over 30. Is it anything like an autobiography then? I don't believe it at all. Any vision of oneself is not even a revision. It's fiction. In this case, it's clear. It's a novel. Had it been written under another name, say George Smith, there would have been no issue. Issue, or is there another word? Fuss. I've forgotten the difference between issue and fuss.
I met the Kosinskis during the occupation. They lived at the Warchows. I had the opportunity to meet Jerzy several times because I chopped wood at their place. During breaks, Mrs. Kosinski would invite us over for tea. We would always exchange a few words with Jerzy then.
Jerzy Kosinski's stroll around Jewish cemeteries in Krakow reminds him of his roots. He was brought up in a wealthy Jewish family of professionals in Lodz. He was 6 when the war broke out. In their attempt to save the son, the parents sent him out to the countryside with a friend, but he abandoned the child, and this is how the much-loved boy's years of travail began. It is hard to describe how much the little boy suffered at the hands of the ignorant peasants. In addition to acute hunger, he was exposed to refined tortures. When a fanatical mob threw him into a cesspit, the boy lost his speech. Miraculously, the 12-year-old was found by Soviet soldiers and reunited with his parents. 3 years later, he regained his speech after a skiing accident. There is much to ponder while strolling among the stones which bring to mind the fate of compatriots who were less fortunate in times of total inhumanity.
What hurt me most was Jerzy's book, The Painted Bird. He lived here like in seventh heaven, had food, shelter, and everything. Yet he ridiculed us so much. How could an educated man go so far? What hurt me most about Jerzy's book is what he wrote about sex with the goats, or about Lech, for instance. Lech lives here today. He is Alexander Tracz.
I wonder if Lech will recognize you. You saw him today?
No, but I recognize him.
Lech won't recognize you, probably. Lech, do you recognize this gentleman? Can't you?
Where from?
During the occupation, he lived in the school building. Do you remember Mr. Migdałek, the teacher?
Very little.
Indeed, this is his son. They lived here together, him and...
Where?
In the old school building in our village.
Here?
Sure, there was Andrzej and Eva, his sister. Can't you remember?
I can't remember.
He's forgotten. There was a big barn here where Lech worked. He used to catch birds there. Among others, he caught a crow, the famous painted bird. He painted it white and let it fly high. He remembers that. The other crows pecked it to death, because the white one was different. He painted it with lime. What else could he use? Lech still remembers how he did that. He caught that crow just here, where the old barn used to be during the German occupation. This is how the painted bird began.
English was good for preventing me from being personal. I had the urge to speak for the child. We don't have the imagination, the memory of ourselves as children. The thing was to create certain states of mind which would take me, then a man of 30, into a child's mindset. English was not the language of my growing up. It helped me a lot in this task.
Jerzy Kosinski was a good boy, a good friend. He wasn't aggressive or quarrelsome. During the occupation, we were together almost every day. We would see each other every day. All the events described in The Painted Bird are distorted, shown in a very bad light. As a rule, these events didn't really happen.
Not at all. What he wrote doesn't bear the slightest resemblance to truth whatsoever. He lived here among us all the time, after all. We were brought up together. We weren't apart from each other for more than a week during the 2.5 years he spent here. And not even a twig fell on his head. No one ever tossed a stone at him or pushed him around. There wasn't anything like that ever, except for those 2 incidents when they wanted to see his private parts to find out if he was Jewish, if you'll excuse me. Other than that, there was nothing. Yet there he was, writing about this cesspit business, as he did in The Painted Bird. How did he come up with this? What was he thinking about?
They survived at the risk of our lives.
If the Germans found out, they'd burn the whole village, with us in it. It didn't take much to surround a village and burn it if they'd found a Jew. Piece of cake.
He should have written a decent book. Praise the village for feeding him, praise Poland, rather than scribbling down such rubbish. It seems that everything there is shown in such a bad light. He says this is how a child sees war. What can such depraved sex have to do with war?
Off it goes. Be careful. The flames are really flaring up now.
My feeling about him was that he was a man who sort of had a theatrical streak. If you said to me, how do you explain him? I would explain him. I think many people don't understand histrionic personalities. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm married to one, but if you don't understand that some people are dramatic, and that being dramatic is part of their personalities, you judge them by the incorrect standards. I mean, for example, dramatic people like Yorick will tell you a story with such intensity that if you're not this kind of person, you may consider him you may confuse the motivation. I mean, you may think he wants something more than what he really wants. What his end most often was, to me, in the way I define it, was to entertain. He had this extraordinary compulsion to be entertaining, and I didn't see it in any other light. The fact that he had his, I have to say, he did have his eye on the ball. He certainly was aware of the competitiveness of the literary scene. And he certainly was aware of making progress in being a star. That certainly was part of it. He said to me after reading my novel, "Why don't you write a book about the boy who masturbates?" And I said, he said, would you write such a book? And I said, no, I wouldn't write it. He says, if you could write such a book and the world would respond to such a book, would you write it? I said, no. He said, because you would think they would say, "Off it the masturbator." It's an interesting thought. I mean, you know, how you consider... I said, I couldn't do it. It isn't a matter of wanting to do it. I couldn't do it. I can only write what I could write. And this strikes me, and he did say this to me, and it was a little startling. And it's kind of, he says, Americans are fascinated by three elements in a book. He said, you have to have in a novel, they have to have very sexual, very political. It has to be political. This country is so obsessed with politics, and an original style of design, something that looks innovative, has to be innovative, you know. Now this was, The Painted Bird had been published by the time we had this particular conversation, and he was already considered a major world writer. I mean, the response to that book had been, you know, very dramatic. And he was working on a book, I think Steps was the next book. And he showed me Steps early. So I read Steps, and it was absolutely what he had just described. You know, it was a book, episodic, almost written in vignettes, understated, with political and sexual you know, incident, and a narrative progression that was innovative. I mean, it really had that combination of elements that he had described.
Doing a documentary, I wanted to ask different people if you know anything about Jerzy Kosinski.
No, I don't, to be honest.
Sam?
Yes. No, I don't know anything. I didn't read anything about it. Do you? No. No. Okay, that's good.
No.
But I hope to one day.
No. Sorry if I come across sounding like a dumb American, but no. I gotta go, okay?
He's been there. The only book I read was Steps. It was okay. He's radical. I read what he wrote about life in... I guess he puts sex into the books because he said that in Europe, where he was living, that was like one of the few good things that he could count on.
Yes, he wrote being there.
Oh, being... Oh.
That's why I said he's been there.
Oh, okay.
It was a joke.
I'm VONNEGUT. I'm a writer. I was a friend of Jerzy Kosinski. I don't remember exactly when we met, but I'm 72 years old now. And on my 54th birthday, he gave me a painted bird. And so somebody else can do the arithmetic, because I knew Jerzy at least that long. I was always charmed and interested by him, and was absolutely wowed by his first two books. It's A Painted Bird and what was the title of the second one? Steps, yeah. I do not know to what extent he was truthful and what he wasn't. He was a great entertainer, and it did not matter because he told stories in order to be interesting, as he often casting himself as a hero. One time he was out at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He was sitting by the pool and being served as though he were a blind person. He found this sort of thing very entertaining. I nominated him for a gentleman's club, which is a Century Club, Century Association, and there are many professions. It's supposed to be an artist club, but every year they have exhibitions of pictures, paintings, or photographs by members who aren't known as graphic artists, but who do it as amateurs. And Jerzy entered these pictures of smashing-looking women, just the most beautiful women you ever saw. and claimed they were all transvestites. I don't think so. and doing this sort of thing, it just entertained him, and somehow it made life worth living. But he liked to be the center of attention, and health problems were a heart attack or going blind or whatever were subjects of conversation. But he was very entertaining when he was among us, and we're very sorry he's gone. And the problem, I think the problem was that he simply wasn't enjoying life anymore. As there was certainly no cabal against him, and he would have had no trouble publishing anything he wanted published. And I think it was his body that made life almost worth living for him, despite all he'd been through, despite how he'd been crippled mentally by the Second World War. So I think that was probably what was unbearable to him, is he wasn't having fun with his body anymore. But they, well, so much, so what's the surprise? It's though you were interviewing me about Baron Munchausen, Yes. Yes, this man often did not tell the truth, but they've been told quite wonderful stories all the same. So he's dead now, so who's to stop him? He got away with it. And he was a wonderful president of Penn. He was about the best president we ever had, in my experience. Very good on human rights. And so, again, this is like chasing down Baron Munchausen. We would all be so much poorer if there weren't all these Munchausen stories. Have you gone to photograph his hiding place in his apartment? He would hide, and guests couldn't find him. And, well, like all artists, he was monstrously screwed up in one way or another, and every effective artist has some huge embarrassment, some huge pain. And Jerzy's happened to be his childhood during the Second World War.
I sit waiting by the phone for it to ring all night, wishing I could hold you tight. But now I know it never will be like those times again, when I could hold you again and again. That night I almost fainted in your secure embrace, hypnotized by your eyes and enthralled by your face. But I thought that this desire would always last. But now all I have is the faded past. If I could fly away to a place where you would be mine till the end of time, where the world would disappear. If only all my wishes would come true, I'd be standing here with you.
Lata temu Jerzy Kosinski,
Years ago, Jerzy Kosinski, my very close friend, a kindred spirit, couldn't understand one thing.
nie mógł zrozumieć pewnej rzeczy.
He always used to ask me, "Why do you sing jazz? You have such a beautiful, smooth, soothing, healing voice, yet your singing is like a piece of crumpled paper." He thought that the music I sing was a combination of cacophony and chaos. He just hated jazz altogether and once asked me, "Ula, please, can you sing for me my favorite Harry Belafonte song?" I was just about to tour Europe for 2 weeks, so I took a keyboard, the score and tape and started going through the piece. I sang it God knows how many times, 100, maybe more. I came back to New York and invited Jerzy over. I remember he sat in the armchair, I sat at the piano and started singing.
Wishing I could hold you tight, but now I know it never will be like those times again when I could hold you again and again. Again and again.
My name is Felix Gross. I'm chairman of the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences in America, established by former members of the pre-war Polish Academy of Sciences. Today the Institute has some 1,500 members, artists, writers, painters, and primarily university professors. I myself am a professor at the City University of New York. I'm also a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences, which I deem to be a great honor. Of course, I'd known Mr. Kosinski since his arrival in New York. We got in touch immediately. He addressed our institute and studied sociology here. I myself am a professor of sociology. We tried to help him in his first endeavors in the U.S. The Institute was a center for émigré intellectuals, a hub of Polish scholars, artists, and writers. It was a center for those who acknowledged their Polish origin and who opposed communist rule. It was also a center of free and independent Polish culture. This is where Kosinski came. I met him almost right after his arrival. We would meet for long conversations, and he struck me as a man with an expansive imagination and fantasy. He was going through hard times then. I think he was working at a bar. I used to tell him, "Don't worry about your job, the first 6 months are always hard, you'll make it later," which happened as I'd foreseen. The first months in America are very difficult. At the time I was working on getting some of my articles published. Previously issued in English, they needed translating. He volunteered to do it, and the Institute published them later. We often met then, and he talked about his wartime history back home. He used to discuss this. To me it was very strange, because at first he would present facts very explicitly. Those facts would slowly become transformed into incredible stories, a fantasy of sorts. What struck me was that he didn't see the border between empirical truth, real facts, and fantasy, which wasn't lies, but just fantasy. Fantasy and imagination are extremely important in science. In fact, this is where everything starts. Every scientific hypothesis relies on imagination or fantasy, but he was a very gifted, intelligent man. We were at dinner once. My daughter was very young then and was petrified by the stories he told at the dinner table. It was before he wrote The Painted Bird. It was quite horrifying to listen to his mixture of fantasy and grotesque imagination. It struck not only me, but others as well. This possibly prompted Wierzyński or others, and to a degree also Strzetelski, to talk him into embarking on a literary career. They saw his literary talent. Later on he coped very well on his own, and I must admit that he never forgot the Institute. He never forgot that the Polish community assisted him in his literary work. He always recalled that in conversation. However, I don't quite believe what I've seen in the press. There have been claims that others ghost wrote for him, that it wasn't his writing, but that of other people he'd hired. This is a complete fallacy and illusion. He was a man of very unique spirit and imagination. And this spirit is revealed in his books. No one can fake that.
Has anyone helped you to write?
My father.
Village Voice, June 22nd, 1982. Jerzy Kosinski's Tainted Words by Jeffrey Stokes and Elliot Fremont Smith. Not a single comma, not a single word is not mine, and not the mere presence of the word, but the reasons why as well, said Jerzy Kosinski, whose first two novels alone would seem to guarantee Kosinski an honored place in the literary history of our time. That place is in jeopardy, though. No novelist with any claim to seriousness can hire people to do without acknowledgement the sort of composition that we usually call writing. To purchase another's words is to cheat the reader, to trash the tradition. For almost 10 years now, Jerzy Kosinski has been treating his art as though it were just another commodity, a widget to be assembled by anonymous hired hands.
I'm Elizabeth Pakoda. I'm the features editor of the Daily News, formerly literary editor of The Nation magazine. And I corresponded with Jerzy Kosinski briefly in about 1976 when he wrote me about a piece that he'd read of mine. And his letter was an interesting letter, though it occurred to me in reading it that he had serious, though standard problems with English, that he was a writer of English as a second language, that his English was certainly not literary English, and it made me wonder about how he produced his books. I subsequently came to the acquaintance of three people who told me that they had Englished his books for him. In other words, what they said they'd done was he would block out a scene and give a sense of what kinds of sentences he wanted in it, and they would put them into colloquial and standard English. Two of those people are still alive. One of them bragged about it to a considerable degree, but neither of those two people are willing to talk about it now. Kosinski was, at that point, a very powerful figure in New York, a very powerful literary celebrity, I guess I should say. What happened was then that the New York Times, a couple of years after I first corresponded with Kosinski, did a cover story in its magazine section on him, showing him bare-chested, wearing polo pants, and it was the story of a literary celebrity who described himself as this country's Joseph Conrad. This made me wonder because I admire Conrad's prose enormously, and I don't admire Kosinski's. I then recontacted the people who told me they had Englished his books, and I thought it would be an amusing exercise to do a story about how a person gets to be a celebrity in New York, how anything that they do after becoming a celebrity probably won't be counted against them. We have an enormous investment in our celebrities. In any case, that started the article that eventually appeared in the Village Voice by Jeffrey Stokes and Elliot Fremont Smith, in which they talked to all of the people. There are more than three, by the way, who Englished his books. There are several. There was one or two for each book. And they produced the article that caused something of a sensation that the Times spent a lot of time refuting. But my project and my interest in it wasn't so much to call a fraud, because it's not a major fraud. I mean, he didn't write particularly good English. It was really a story, from my point of view, about celebrity and how once it gets going, we have such an investment in it that we never really knock it down. So that was basically my interest in the whole thing. When this started, in particular one woman who had done this, and who had bragged about it quite a lot, got a phone call from him as soon as he heard about this article. As soon as he heard that Jeff Stokes and Elliot Fremont Smith were working on this article, he called her, and he called one of the men, and sort of let them know that he was watching. The one fellow who did go on the record, who I believe his name is Richard Hayes, yes, he did show up at Richard Hayes' door. He did call him persistently. He did let him know that he should be worried. It's sort of an interesting thing to do. I mean, to threaten someone without literally threatening them. All he was going to do would make things a little uncomfortable for them in literary circles, let's say. Remember, he was very, very close to the people at the top in the Times. That's how he happened to be on the cover of New York Times Magazine. And the important thing about Kosinski is he's a colorful character. Not a great novelist, not an important literary figure, but a very colorful character. His celebrity came from that. There was never any attempt to harm or destroy him. It was a question of whether the truth would make any difference in his reputation. But he had a strong sort of totalitarian sense of what should happen in the literary world, Kosinski. You know, that no negative things should be published. He wanted to be in a pantheon of great international authors with, you know, Carlos Fuentes and Milan Kundera and people like that. That's the difference. That's the difference.
I think when I said that Jerzy was not telling us the truth, I don't mean so much about his life, which finally was his own business, but about his art, which is the business of all of us. When a writer, it seems to me that when a writer is asked about how he or she puts together a piece of art, the writer can either say, it's none of your business, it's mine, or the writer can say, well, sure, here's what I was thinking of, here's how it came to be. What I don't think a writer has an artist can dissemble and go halfway. Either you say it's none of your business, or you tell the truth. I think the reason that that's important is that the way Jerzy put together his books is, so far as I can tell, nearly unique in the history of literary composition. There are people who have had assistants to do one thing or another, but this serial mode of getting someone to work on a draft, and then someone else to work on the next one, and someone else to work on the next one. So you have 3, 4 hands shaping the book, and one mind shaping the book. I mean, I think what we said in the piece, I don't recall it exactly, is that Jerzy may have been the author of his novels, but he was not the writer. And there's a distinction. Of course he had other choices. The one choice, I mean, a really interesting choice, it seems to me, would have been to say, yes, I, Jerzy Kosinski, have invented a new mode of literary composition. These books are my books. I have created them, but I've used the hands of others. My mind, their hands. And it's a brand new form. And America, with its love for novelty, would have said, Jerzy, we love you even more. You've created something brand new.
My writing is based on the principle of inner harmony. Of course, we know this. It's what I develop to the highest possible degree. Paper is patient, so I put down anything that comes to mind, then erase, and this is how this accordion contracts. Then I reopen some parts, make versions of versions of versions, which my wife retypes. Myself, I use a standard Olympia portable typewriter. I use 4 fingers, unlike Americans, who are born attached to the typewriter and type with all fingers, not looking at the keys or text. Then I make corrections in pencil, or say ink. My wife retypes this. For some time, I was hiring proofreaders who were checking whether the text, retyped by my wife, conformed with the previous versions because the lines go in all directions. But recently, I've rented a photocopier that magnifies. So I type a page, then enlarge it, so I have lots of space to add things in between the lines. It's very useful.
I got a sense on the one hand of desperation, and this is just a sense of desperation on the one hand, and his enjoying the game on the other hand. There were, part of his way of operating was not to answer the obvious questions. He'd answer a question by asking another or deflecting it. I'm reminded suddenly of President Bill Clinton, who will tell 90% of the truth, but seems to leave out the 10%, for no reason.
The New Yorker, June 13th, 1994. Rocco Landsman. We never thought of any of the ideas or scenes, but English wasn't Jerzy's first language. He didn't have the most facile English writing style. We would reshape paragraphs and rewrite and reorder sentences. I would call it heavy editing. For example, he had the whole idea of being there. He had the whole thing set up. But he did it in this very matter-of-fact, totally declarative prose. It was a wonderful idea for a story, one of his best ones. He was fascinating. Never a boring moment. I do think, though, that his books started deteriorating once I stopped writing them.
It seems to me that he got trapped in a situation where he had started doing his books in this certain way, the novels, and then he couldn't admit to that, because if he had admitted to that if he'd said, well, I can't write the novels in the usual way, that would have meant that neither could he have written those first 2 Novak books. And then he would have been saying, well, I did that, I had some help from the government. And then he would have been seen as an agent of the United States government. And that would have compromised what he was doing in the Pen Club and trying to help writers from Eastern Europe. And I think it would have, he was trapped in the changing of the times.
Rumor has it that you had other people help you to write. Editors, proofreaders, friends, or your wife. For some, it is simply unbelievable that someone with just a few years in the U.S. can become a successful writer.
I think this is a matter of definition.
To remind our viewers, I am referring to an allegation made a few years ago in the Village Voice that you're not the author of your books, that they were written by ghostwriters. I think you've answered that one.
Wouldn't it be nice to have someone churning out a book a year for you, rather than sit on your own and toil for 4 years on one piece, actually 6 on the latest one?
My name is Peter Skinner. I've known Jerzy since the early 60s. In fact, we met very close to this park at a party. In those days, he was a mysterious figure. Did not tell me he was a writer. But later on, during dinner one night, he said to me, would I look at a manuscript? I showed willing. It was the complete English language text of The Painted Bird. I said I found it extremely interesting, very powerful, and he said to me, I'd like you to edit this for me. I said, well, I don't do that sort of work, but I could find you someone. Oh, no, he said, I'd like you to do this. So evening by evening, we'd meet up, mainly after I'd finished my teaching job. And over the course of about a year and a half, we made many, many changes. And he, too, made changes on top of my changes. It was a very mobile situation. And lo and behold, the book was published to great success, of course. Then we had a pause, maybe 3 or 4 months, and he began writing steps. In this case, it was very different. He would dictate to me. I would type as he dictated. Now, his speaking style was very, very eclectic, rather strange. So I'd edit more or less from my head, and what I put on the typewriter might very well differ a lot from his actual words. He then, of course, re-edit this. I'd edit his edits, and so it went on. And this way, the second book was born, very different in type, very different in style, very different in structure. It was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun working together. Much of what we wrote was finally dropped from the book. We probably wrote twice as much as was finally published. But I never sensed an underlying plan. It came in spurts. It came in explosions of imagination. He's very enthusiastic. He would seize upon a phrase. We'd embroider it. He'd say, well, let's do it this way. No, 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 he must do that. No, 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 she didn't. She wouldn't. This would not be right. We shall do it this way, Peter. And there's a lot of play between us. He had confidence in my judgments, and I had confidence in his imagination. We made an extremely good team. We worked easily, no friction. In all sense, it's still a game. It doesn't have to even be published. There wasn't anything in life. He was also, I think, beginning to teach at that time, so he had other interests. Well, I think one thing that we might bear in mind is that in this country, any foreigner who has a distinctive look or accent tends to get a good reception and rather more play in the marketplace. One thing that did strike me is that Jurek's presentation and manner have a touch of Kafka, the slightly haunted face, the intense gaze. It was easy for the media to build mystery around him, even more than he might have created mystery around himself. It fitted any publishing house's marketing program. This was made to sell. It did catch the imagination of a generation of college students. This obviously gave a tremendous sales momentum. So the book made the man made the book, both made the image and the mystery.
When you left Poland 30 years ago, you were leaving as Jerzy Kosinski, a graduate of Łódź University,
and intern of the Polish Academy of Sciences, if I may correct you, plus author of 2 historical works published by the Łódź Scientific Society, long before you were born. Kosinski remembers this very well, while some journalists have forgotten or haven't done their homework.
Anyway, you were leaving as someone unknown to the general public. Now you're returning with flying colors. You're not the first Pole to come back home in such circumstances and in such a manner.
My dear sir, I really don't know what flying colors means. However, I can see a very strong light here which is blinding me. If being blinded by the spotlight means coming back with flying colors, then I'll be quite happy to take this as a definition of myself.
I didn't finish my question. Your back with flying colors arouse immense interest and are accompanied by journalists.
I'm accompanied only by my wife, who's not a journalist. Once again, you haven't done your homework.
But your books aren't very well known in this country.
They are completely unknown.
You defined yourself as a fringe writer. I found such a statement in an interview published in the Polish press.
Yes, but did I say how wide the fringe was?
How wide is it then?
That depends on how you look at it.
I first got to know Jerzy Kosinski when I was head of the nominating committee for PEN in 1973. Actually, I was the president of PEN, the American Center of PEN, at that time, and I was working with the nominating committee. I think that's a better way to put it. And we decided that we would ask Jerzy to be my successor at PEN. And he took my phone call, and we were delighted when he said, "I accept immediately," instantly. He didn't debate in this for one moment. This was something I think that he liked and to do, wanted to do, and felt that he could really make a contribution in this job. I should say that to be president of PEN is a certain mark of distinction among American writers. You know, we look for a writer who has a reputation because the organization can then profit from that reputation in various ways. So that was one of the main reasons we asked him. He had won a National Book Award and was generally regarded as a very distinguished writer. So we were pleased that he said yes, and it was nice that he was pleased too. I had a curious experience right after we announced that he would be the next president of PEN. I got a call from a man named George Reevy, who was a translator. PEN, as you can imagine, we're connected to international PEN, so the translators are a very important part of PEN. And I knew Reevy personally. I was very active in the translation committee, getting them money to translate things and that sort of stuff. And so Reevy said to me, "Tom, you can't let Jerzy Kosinski be president of PEN." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because the man is a fraud. He didn't write The Painted Bird. I did." Well, I was astonished, to put it mildly. And I said, "George, how can you say that? Are you drinking or what?" And he said, "No, no, no, this is the truth. He brought me a manuscript which was a mess, and I took it, translated. Some of it was in English, some of it was in Polish. I translated it, I whipped it into shape. I basically wrote the book, and all he gave me for this trouble was $500. He never paid me anything more than that, and I hate his guts. But more than that, he said, this would be an outrage to put a man of such low character in as president of PEN." Well, I knew this man. I did respect George Reevy, but I still couldn't quite believe the whole story. So naturally, I called up Jerzy. I didn't feel that this was the way to go, it seemed to me. So we had a very frank talk. He said, "Yes, indeed, I did seek George Reevy's help when I first worked on The Painted Bird. And he did help me with my English and some grammar, and he polished the work to a certain extent. And I did pay him some money. I don't even remember how much he said at the time, but I thought I paid him what he deserved to get at that time for the work he did. And that's my side of the story." So we talked it over at PEN, and we decided that we just couldn't accept Reevy's extreme version of the whole thing, that he had literally written the book. It just was beyond belief. And so we just dropped the whole subject and allowed Jerzy to become president. And as I said, I'm happy to report he was a very, very good president of PEN. He particularly loved the international side of the job and the work that PEN did to try to get writers help from harassment, you know, and particularly in communist countries and also in any other country in the world where writers were being repressed for one reason or another. There was a certain tendency in Jerzy, I think, to particularly delight in outwitting governments. Not just communist governments, but all governments, but particularly communist governments. And he often told me the story, I gather it's one of many versions he told me about how he got out of Poland by calling up various functionaries and demanding a passport, demanding this, demanding that, and finally leaving the country practically with a a shower of praise and scraping, bowing officials getting him on a plane and so forth. He according to him, he completely intimidated everybody and managed to leave without the slightest worry of being arrested or anything like that.
Time is like an ocean, and its eternal power. But the wave can even last a fraction of an hour. But we must not question why or when. Just capture the moment whenever we can. This is called a memory, which can last longer than any sea, because that special moment never again will be. Time is like an ocean, and its eternal power. But a wave can never last.
I think it's difficult to say just where Jerzy stands. He certainly, there was a cloud cast over his career by the allegations that he had not written his work, all of it. And I think there is, alas, a certain amount of evidence that does indicate that although he may have very well written The Painted Bird, I do believe that, I think there is a certain amount of evidence indicating that his English was never really his written English, although his spoken English was fluent and almost impeccable, that his written English, as is often the case with someone who comes to a second language, was not as good as it might have been, and that he required a great deal of help from other writers. This, as I say, has indeed, I think, cast a cloud over his whole career, although not so much as to any means make that career negligible, because his works had considerable impact. I'm thinking especially of a book like Being There, which I think was one of his best books. Was a remarkable sort of story, which really had a great prophetic quality, in the sense that it actually predicted that we would have presidents, as we did in the form of Ronald Reagan, who had no need to think at all. And that was almost a prophecy of that remarkable work of Jerzy's called Being There. So I think he will always occupy a very interesting and unique corner of American literature, an enigmatic one. I think Jerzy was a writer, far more a writer of ideas than of what we could call, you know, for want of a better word, literature. Jerzy became a celebrity, there's no doubt about it, a kind of superstar. That annoyed a lot of people. And I think there were writers who felt that he was striving beyond his ability as a writer, that his status as celebrity eclipsed his ability as a writer. And that may be true. I know that one of the fascinating things about Jerzy was that he almost classically fell in the mold of the young immigrant coming to America and being bedazzled by all of the extraordinary possibilities of this country, having to do with wealth, fame, celebrity, power, and so on. He was plainly smitten by it. I don't find anything necessarily wrong with this. There are worse things in the world. But I think the very thing that would endorse this theory of mine is the fact of his marriage to Mary Weir, this extraordinarily rich girl. There's nothing wrong with marrying money. I'm not making a value judgment out of this, but I'm saying that Jerzy was dazzled by this aspect of American life. A young immigrant on the make. He's trying to get ahead in a very aggressive way, any way he can. I would introduce him to rich and famous people, and within seconds he'd be, you'd hear the next day that Jerzy had turned up on their doorstep. And he was so charming, however, that these rich and famous people would immediately take him under their wing. And that's why I say he was sort of an actor. He was always acting, playing parts, playing roles, even to his friends, where he wanted to charm and attract people. But interestingly enough, he failed at that in certain ways because he had a repertory of these stories, and once he had told them, they lost their freshness. He didn't know the limits of his talent and charm. He began to do things which even I, who was very loyal to Jerzy, felt was extreme, which is playing polo with multimillionaires in wherever they play polo. This seemed, to us who are committed sort of Democrats and liberals, this seemed a little outré. But I cared for Jerzy. I was very fond of him, so this did not seem to me a major sin. It seemed to be, if anything, one of his peccadillos.
And I've known Jerzy, for probably 20 years. I guess about maybe 18, 20 years. I think the best word to describe Jerzy was enthusiastic. He had great enthusiasm for everything he did. He was always around polo, and he loved polo, and his wife was always with him, and she was a great polo enthusiast, and he watched many of our games that we played in Palm Beach and all over the world. A number of times I offered to let him ride some of my horses and practice on my horses, and he wanted to make sure I gave him an easy one, right? One that he could bring back to the barn. He was not much of a player. I mean, you know, he was really a beginner type player. But he was a better author than he was a polo player, but he was a great enthusiast and a great fan. And everybody loved Jerzy.
What would you say about this book?
In a way, for me, it's the intellectual essence of writing. There is a certain sense in which it closes a whole cycle of 9 novels. From now on, I'll try doing something completely new, so I'm starting on a play. Let's see what comes of it. We're talking about a book that I called The Hermit of 69th Street. It's written with a poetic approach, meaning that I can do whatever I want with it. I have an almost biblical freedom to fantasize and so on. In a way, it's a testament of the literary method, not Jerzy Kosinski's testament. However, this being the latest work, it might also be the last.
But also we found it difficult to believe that this man who was so full of life, so absolutely
so funny, extremely funny.
And yet premonitions of that suicide are in this book. There is actually in the book a description of the suicide exactly as he did it. So if one had been a little more perceptive, it is very possible that that one could have seen that he was just not writing about it, he was planning. One wonders, too, that as a Jew and as a descendant of the painted bird, does a little boy, sensitive little boy, which Jerzy was, does he ever recover from that experience? Or was he doomed sooner or later, perhaps, to take his own life in some way?
I, Jerzy N. Kosinski, of the city, county, and state of New York, which I hereby declare to be my domicile, do make, publish, and declare this to be my last will. Paragraph A. All books, pamphlets, magazines, photographs, manuscripts, and research material I give and bequeath to the Spiritus College of Judaica of Chicago, Illinois.
I saw him for the last time at a party book party given by a mutual friend, Gay Talese. And a few days later, I was driving, 2 or 3 days later, I was driving with my wife in Florida on the way to a hotel for a vacation. And I said to her, I'm worried about Jerzy Kosinski. And she said, why? And I said, well, he seemed very unhappy. He showed me, it was interesting, he showed me his unhappiness. He said he wasn't writing well. He felt a writing block. He had thoughts of his father who had died with illness. He was a worried man about it. He had a disturbance in him. Anyway, I was riding with my wife to a hotel in South Florida, and I said to her, I'm worried about Kosinski. He looks very unhappy. And then 2 hours later, we arrived at the hotel, and there was a message from my secretary to call the office, which I did, and she told me that Kosinski had killed himself.
In my essay, I called him an unparalleled prankster. I thought of him as this man with a suitcase who opens it and pulls out 1,000 tricks suitable for any occasion. This is who he was to me, a man of so many facets that no one really knew him. And he always had a new, unexpected trick. He liked to shock, set up surprises, do shocking things. He enjoyed seeing how people would react to this. This is my impression of him, an unhappy clown, because clowns aren't happy.
May 3rd, 1991, 12:45 a.m. Dear Keeks, I am going to sleep now. Today, I will be sleeping a little bit longer.